everyone. Thank you so much for joining Gwinnett County Public Library and the University of North Georgia for our Great Decisions series, Climate Change and the Global Order program. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I work for Gwinnett County Public Library's Adult Programming Department. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Jamie Mitchem began his career volunteering in the South Carolina State Climate Office and interning with the Southeast Regional Climate Center. He served as a research assistant in the Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute at the University of South Carolina and the Mesoscale Meteorology Research Lab at North Carolina State University. He has taught at the university level for over 15 years. Dr. Mitchem was awarded the first HAZAS User of the Year award by FEMA for the first quarter of 2007. Dr. Mitchem has also presented at more than 40 professional conferences, provided multiple workshops on GIS and emergency management at FEMA's higher education conferences, and he has authored multiple research reports to summarize the results from grant work and white papers to advise on best practices. Dr. Mitchem's research interests include hazards, geography, disasters, GIS, meteorology, climatology, climate change, emergency management, social vulnerability, risk communication, and tornadoes. His interests focus on the complex interactions between society and nature. He has recently worked on a UNG Presidential Innovation Award analyzing UNG students' attitudes about climate change. Dr. Mitchem has been elected as Chair of Faculty Senate for 2019 to 2020. He is currently working on an EPA grant educating Georgia citizens on native forest ecosystems and sustainable practices with Dr. Allison Bailey, and he has previous grants from NASA, U.S. Department of Justice, EPA, FEMA, and the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. He also is collaborating with Emory University, UGA, and Georgia Tech as part of the Georgia Climate Project. He currently works as a professor of geography, GIS, at the University of North Georgia. Please welcome Dr. Jamie Mitchem.
Oh, thank you. That person sounds impressive. Thank you for that. And I want to thank the library system for inviting me out to speak and for you all showing up on a sunny afternoon after all this rain. It's, I know, tempting to be outside. So thank you very much. I want to go through the presentation, and then I also want to leave time for questions and answers afterwards, so please participate. Moving right ahead. So our planet is an asset that we all depend on for survival, so I think that's one fundamental thing that's important here. And just with the picture, you can see three components that are extremely important that are interrelated: the atmosphere that we'll focus predominantly on, but also the oceans and the land and the people that live on it. So all these are connected, and one thing that happens in any of those systems affects the other systems. So scientifically, that's important. Our atmosphere, if you really look at it, is a very thin film of air that surrounds our planet, unique to our planet as well. And really what we're talking about here scientifically is processes that we're doing that are altering the chemistry of the atmosphere and the air, and then that impacts the chemistry of the oceans and has impacts on plants and animals and humans. So we'll look at that. The one that gets the most news is carbon dioxide for several reasons. It's the one that we're altering the quickest, the gas in the atmosphere, and it stays in the atmosphere for a very long period of time. So what we're doing today has impacts for multiple generations. You may hear about methane some as well, and we are having a big impact there, and it's a very potent greenhouse gas. But the good news on methane is you can get it out of the atmosphere naturally fairly quickly, like 10 to 20 years, whereas here we're talking centuries that we're keeping these levels high. So if we look at what's producing carbon dioxide emissions, there's a few things. Coal historically has been one of the big producers of carbon dioxide. We burn that largely for electricity production, oil as well for gasoline-powered vehicles, transportation, and increasingly natural gas, which is also a fossil fuel, not quite as CO2 intensive as coal, but natural gas is really replacing coal for electricity production. And then of course we have renewables that don't produce the emissions. If we look geographically, and I am a geographer at heart, We see two countries that play a big role here, China and the United States. China's overtaken the United States as the biggest producer of carbon dioxide in the world, but they also have a much larger population. So per capita, the U.S. is still one of the top ones. EU's in there as well. And increasingly, we're seeing parts of the Middle East and Asia outside of China growing in their production. So it is a global challenge. And one thing we're seeing, I think, with many issues is trying to get global cooperation and participation to address these challenges is proving extremely difficult. So if we look at emissions per capita, like the intensity of production of CO2, we see the U.S. is pretty high there, so we domestically have some things to think about. We see some of our oil-intensive countries in the Middle East, like United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Brunei, down here, an oil-rich country, all have high CO2 emission rates. Generally, we see countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southeast Asia have fairly low CO2 emission rates, and that's going to come up later, this inequity of the people that are contributing the least often being impacted the most first, and that's a kind of ethical, moral dilemma. All right, so what produces CO2? A good little graphic to summarize some of the big components of that. Coal-fired power plants are one of the biggest producers of carbon dioxide emissions. Domestically as well, Georgia has a big role in that. So plant share, you've probably seen some of that in the news lately in Juliet, concerns about coal ash, the impact that may have on people's health is in the news. That was at one point the biggest producer of carbon dioxide of any power plant in the entire United States. And then in McDonough plant, Bowen was the third highest. So Georgia has two massive producers of CO2 right here in our state. Transportation's another big one. Trucks, cars, and so on that are burning gasoline and producing emissions out the tailpipe that includes carbon dioxide. Industrial scale agriculture produces a lot of methane in particular, but CO2 in general. And then transporting that from across the world to our grocery stores also produces a lot of CO2. So thinking of how to do agriculture more locally, more sustainably, is a big part of the solution as well. And then there's others. Our deforestation and wildfires pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as well. So if we measure this, the Keeling was a scientist that put a measurement device out in Hawaii, where the air is pretty clear out in the middle of the Pacific, to monitor carbon dioxide levels, and we get the Keeling curve. And at Scripps, you can go to their website and you can see what the current levels are. So currently we're up around 413 parts per million, right? And that may not mean a lot. One thing it tells you, parts per million means there's 413 parts of carbon dioxide for a million particles of other air. And the vast majority of our air is nitrogen and oxygen. But when we really start looking at that, where we are today at 413 is much higher than we were when I was born, right? Than we were born. We're rapidly increasing the amount of CO2 in the air. You can see these kind of little up and down blips here. That's the seasons of every year. So carbon dioxide accumulates over the winter time because we don't have as much photosynthesis to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So that's each little blip upward. And then the leaves come out as they're about to and pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and you see it go down. Mainly in response to northern hemisphere seasons, because that's where most land masses are, all of Asia, North America, even most of big chunk of Africa, and even South America, part of it, Europe. That's where a lot of the trees are. So it responds mainly to northern hemisphere seasons. So that's fairly alarming in and of itself. If we extend the time period, though, you can really see where we are. Right, if this was the map at the mall, you'd have a you are here, right? You are here, right, up at 413 parts per million. And this is the past 800,000 years where carbon dioxide levels naturally are. And so naturally, they would be in this kind of range over here between, let me see if I can find my cursor, we'll just say between 180 and 280 parts per million. Usually a little bit low during the ice ages, right? Our most recent ice age ended about 10,000 years ago. And then interglacials, the warm periods between ice ages, were usually about 280 parts per million. So we're in an interglacial period, but instead of being at 280, we're up at 413. So it really shows you that rapid impact really the Industrial Revolution had in pumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. All right, so you can see the rate at which we're doing that, 110 million tons of that every day into the atmosphere, just rapidly amplifying and changing our chemistry faster than ever in human history. So I always say this to my students. I'm a scientist, and so in one way, I view this as a really interesting experiment, right? So that's kind of exciting. I like experiments, and we don't always know the outcome. We can predict it and see what happens. So scientifically, this is intriguing and interesting, but I am in the experiment, right, as are you, and that's terrifying, right? That's scary because we don't know all the impacts, and we do know some are going to be pretty disruptive. And then I'm a parent, right, and that's infuriating what we're doing to my child and your child and everybody's, future generations that they don't have a voice in, and that's really why you see probably some of the activism out there today. All right, so what does this mean? Once you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, so it traps heat that's trying to escape from the earth at night, right? It doesn't change the amount of sunlight. That stays the same during the day that comes in. That's at short wavelengths. But at night, the earth tries to give off some of that heat and cool down the earth's surface and atmosphere. If you ever stand over a parking lot at night or next to the brick building and you feel the heat coming off, that's long-wave radiation, terrestrial radiation. Greenhouse gases trap that, prevent it from escaping, and that's what warms up the atmosphere. As you warm up the atmosphere, you warm up the oceans, and we'll talk about that. So, you hear a lot about the Paris Agreement and plans to try to address climate change. The Paris Agreement's really important, and I highly recommend we get back into it, so I'll definitely say that. The Paris Agreement basically takes us towards this purplish trajectory here. This is what we've done so far, right? And this is where we're going. So the idea is to kind of plateau emissions and bring them down over time. And the pledges get us to about a 2.5 degree probably location by the end of the century. What we're actually doing compared to those pledges is even less ambitious at this point. The real goal was that the Paris Agreement would be a start, right? We would meet again, assess the progress at that time and become a little more stringent and ambitious, and hopefully reduce our emissions so that we're only increasing global temperatures 2 degrees Celsius is the global agreement. Even Kuwait and oil countries have agreed going beyond 2 degrees Celsius is not wise or safe, that society starts to be disruptive beyond that. For developing countries, really 1.5 degrees is what they're pushing for because it's more dangerous for them sooner. But we're not there yet, right? And with the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement and Brazil likely following our lead, we have 2 big producers that are, ignoring a lot of this and kind of going this direction. So if anything, we're probably currently, at least, on this higher side. We can't predict the future, so who knows what's going to happen here. But, if we need to be here, being here is something's going to have to give there. But again, it's that global cooperation agreement. That's the challenge. How are you going to get every country to agree? How are you going to make these binding agreements so that if anyone doesn't follow what they say, that there's some repercussion, right? That's a challenge globally. All right, and time-wise, the longer we wait, the harder it is to get to that level. And once we reach a certain point, we really can't be aiming for 2 degrees anymore. We got to it won't be possible at some point. Even with zero emissions, you've built into the system enough carbon dioxide that wouldn't be possible beyond the middle of the century. All right, so what is happening to temperature? We can record that as well. Right, we have data out there that shows temperatures are rising. So our thermometer data shows that globally. This was a fascinating study, berkeley.earth.org. You can go there and you can see all the data. They share the data publicly for free online. That was a study that was done by a physicist out at Berkeley who was a skeptic, kind of climate change. And he said, I'm not sure, this doesn't make sense to me, and maybe it's just urbanization having an impact on temperature, some interesting theories. And so he wanted to look at the data, and he got funding from the Koch brothers to do that study, and he did it, right? He got the data, he did the study, and that's what the black line is here, which matches almost 100% with what NASA, NOAA, the Hadley Center of Europe already had computed. So it actually reaffirmed that yes, warming is occurring and it's predominantly due to humans. And he came out publicly and stated that, which was good science. Probably won't get funding again from that source, but interesting scientific study. And the warming that we're seeing is not consistent throughout this century. Well, it is consistent, but it's accelerating. I think that's the other thing that's important to realize is that the problem is growing, right, amplifying, getting worse. And so most of the heating's been in the latter half of the 20th century and in the 21st century, not at the beginning of the century. And where it's happening is really clear, that it's in the Arctic and over land masses quite often. All right, so examples. Again, there's a lot of times people confuse weather with climate, so I'll make sure I point that out. Weather are short-term changes in the atmosphere, usually in one specific location. So you can have a heat wave, a cold spell, it could snow somewhere. That doesn't prove or disprove climate change. That's weather conditions. For climate, you want to look at trends over time, averages, and you want to look at large areas, like continents or global. But we can see a lot of weather events that are pointing towards what climate models are predicting. Just a couple examples, right? Hottest month in China's history, which is a long history. Heat index of 165 in Iran, right? Combination of heat and increasing humidity to levels where they have to keep people inside, right, for their own safety. And 2003, I think, was the big wake-up call. Huge heat wave in Europe that killed over 70,000 people. And that was like in France and Switzerland and well-developed economies. So this isn't just a problem for the developing world, right? We would be naive to think that. And heat kills more people than any other weather-related hazard. It's just not known because there's not good video of heat like there is of a tornado or a hurricane. But heat kills more people than those hazards every year, even here in the U.S. All right, so I mentioned this, when we start getting heat and humidity at levels that are quickly producing heat stroke, you may be talking about parts of the world becoming uninhabitable, right? Persian Gulf is one part of the world where people would have to limit their time outdoors. It's going to have economic issues for outdoor work. They try to build things that are underground now, tunnels and that kind of thing, to avoid your outdoor exposure. So you can adapt, but what kind of quality of life is that, and what kind of psychological effect would you have when you can't get outdoors and sense and feel nature? Military is trying to address a lot of the concerns occurring right now. I mean, the training they have to go through is intense, on a good day, and to add that heat component to it makes it deadly. We've seen cases of that, particularly here in the South, like Parris Island, Fort Jackson, Fort Benning, where heat can become deadly, even to people that are, in really good shape. I went to a talk recently by a person that's responsible for safety on one of the forts, and the two concerns, one was the heat, right? Just the level of the temperature, and that you can get hyperthermia, your body temperature getting too hot, like a high fever, that can kill you. The other, though, was water intoxication. There was a sign that people were drinking so much water trying to prepare for the heat that was actually killing some of the soldiers. So that is bizarre and important to understand and try to educate the appropriate way to deal with the heat. So I mentioned that a little bit. We also had a speaker that came to actually the Dahlonega campus of UNG, the military college, and he said the way the military often views this is not through the political lens, and that they don't have time to have the debate and argument about it. They just have to address it, right? They have a mission they have to achieve, and they don't have time for the political debate, which is actually reassuring to hear. You don't want them bogged down in that. People working outdoors is a huge concern. Roofers, construction, highway, workers are exposed to the heat. And again, no matter your age, that can be dangerous to people. So these were the deaths just in 1 year in the United States from outdoor workers in the heat. I'll leave it at that. Well, I'll mention this. This is fascinating. The sex of certain reptiles is determined by the temperature in the nest while the eggs are in there. So we may see, a skewing of one gender, whichever one is promoted by heat, and things like alligators and snakes, and that's an extinction concern when they're all, one gender. All right, so here's a video that kind of shows a time series of global temperatures. Blues are below the long-term normal average. Yellows and reds are going to be above the long-term average. So you can see here by the 1960s and 70s, as we really started using fossil fuels pretty intensely, it increases. And by the end of this time period, we have a lot of red and orange over the entire globe, right? That's warmer than average temperatures, and they're most concentrated in the Arctic. In the Arctic, there's a feedback mechanism that's reinforcing the warming, where you're melting ice cover that reflects sunlight and keeps it cool. As you melt it, you expose soil or rock or water, which is darker in color, like the parking lot outside. That absorbs the sunlight, heats the area up, melts more ice, exposes more soil. It just starts feeding on itself at that point. So we're amplifying the heating in the Arctic right now. Two other kind of ominous signals in here, this little cool area in the North Atlantic and down here, are likely the response of melting ice as well from Greenland and from this peninsula in Antarctica. That fresh water goes out into the ocean and it sits on top of the salt water beneath it because it's less dense. It's relatively cold because it's just ice, and it's regionally cooling the waters there. So that regional cooling is actually a signal of a warming planet. All right, close to home, heat. If we look at the days per year above 95, on average, we've had about 7. Last summer, we broke the record for the number of days above 90 in Atlanta. By the end of the century, just to show you how many more we could expect on average, you're really looking at a lot more days that are pretty warm, and particularly for both age extremes, really young, really old, or people with health concerns, this can be, dangerous. So locally, some of our big concerns are definitely going to be heat and health impacts from that. Mosquitoes, we'll look at that. Agricultural impacts. Those are some of the big impacts inland, away from just sea level rise on the coast. All right, so a lot of impacts of a warming planet, from sea level rise, melting ice, more intense precipitation because we're amplifying the water cycle as we add heat and energy into the atmosphere, species moving poleward and upward. Right? There's a lot of changes here. So it's beyond just temperature. That's why climate change is a better term, really, than just global warming. Right? It's more than just temperature. All right, if we look at ice real quickly, here you can see a couple of the glaciers in the early 20th century compared to later. Right? So this is a pretty rapid time period in geologic time scales. This is the same location. Right? There's that mountain peak, and you can see where the ice was in 1928 versus 2004. Pretty remarkable. Same thing here in Alaska, so southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere. This is that same mountain back here where ice was, right, a glacier at that time. Now we even have vegetation here, just remarkably rapid environmental changes occurring. And this is another one of those things, once you've kind of crossed this threshold, even if we go back to normal, right, to temperatures we had in the 1920s, you don't get that glacier back in the time that you lost it. Right? That takes a long time to accumulate, probably centuries, and we're losing that in decades. So, just turning the carbon dioxide off, that's really important, is a small step in the right direction because it will remain there for centuries. All our reference glaciers we can see are declining quickly. This is just since 1980, the volume of those glaciers. All right, so examples of problems that can happen, or there's viruses and bacteria that are locked up in that ice that could be released as they melt. that we may not have immunities to, right? This is not a case of that occurring right now, but it shows, how there are a lot of health impacts potentially from changing our environment this quickly. All right, other examples we can see here, melting glaciers, time series. I'm going to continue on because you get the idea. Greenland, our two big ice caps are Greenland in the northern hemisphere and Antarctica in the southern hemisphere. So this is where a lot of water is stored as ice currently. In Greenland, we see the declining volume over time. When it's on land, like Greenland or Antarctica, and you melt that ice, it does contribute to sea level rise, right? You're adding water to the ocean. The melting Arctic doesn't really affect sea level a whole lot because that ice is already in the ocean. It's like the ice in your drink. When it melts, the drink doesn't ever flow. It's already accounted for. But Antarctica and Greenland, those are the concerns for sea level. So here we see the change in ice mass in Greenland. This is measured by a satellite that senses small changes in gravity and rapid declines that are occurring there. And obviously this is, again, going into the ocean, contributing to sea level rise. So there's a little bit of what that looks like. So the scale of change is very dramatic, and this is a remote area, but to actually see it happening, I think is important. All right, so we see this decline over time of ice in the Arctic. Again, not important really for sea level, but really important for other reasons. A couple things I want to point out. One is it changes temperature, right? You're making a darker colored surface here. It's opening up new corridors. So there actually is an economic opportunity here for trade. China now sends ships across north of Russia here instead of going through Singapore and Suez Canal. It's a shorter route, it's cheaper. But as we increase trade here, we're going to have a few potential problems. Conflict, for one, right? Competing countries. Russia's building a lot of military bases up here, preparing for oil extraction in the Arctic. The U.S., right, with Alaska here also involved, and so there's this, kind of Cold War mentality returning, especially to the Arctic, and concerns about conflict there, which would be very different than traditional forms of conflict, most likely. So thinking national security-wise, this is concerning. China is buying up pieces of Greenland to get access to the Arctic. Canada and Europe as well have access there. Traditional indigenous populations, Eskimo, Inuit people, are pretty furious about this. One is it threatens their whole way of life, right? If you can't hunt and fish, as ice declines and new civilizations come in, they're going to lose their way of life, right? There's no McDonald's to go to in northern Canada. It's traditional forms of life. So their existence is threatened, right? They may have to relocate their youth to a city far away instead of traditional forms of living. And they contributed very little to the problem. It's one of those other issues where they're paying the price for other people's actions. All right, I don't think the animation works, but I'll show. This is the Arctic. The color coding here is the age of the ice. So the lighter the color, the older the ice is. And over time, what's happened is the oldest ice, the multi-year ice, has been declining. And a lot of this is becoming seasonal, right? It freezes up in the winter and it melts in the summer. We still have ice in the Arctic, right? So we can't over-exaggerate that. That's not helpful. But it is less than in the past. It's thinner than in the past. It doesn't last as long as in the past. And that is concerning, right? So by the end of the century, we will have very little left, most likely in parts of the Arctic. The oldest tends to be right here. It actually generates here in a little gyre, and then it goes out here and melts naturally. And we're getting less and less in this gyre in that animation, right? So less old, thick ice, which makes it more prone to melting, more seasonal. And it says playing video, but I don't think it's going to, so I'm going to go on for the sake of time. So Antarctica, this is our biggest ice cap. So this is a continent with ice on top of it, very thick ice, some places over a mile thick, and could contribute a lot to sea level rise. Again, to be factual, We're not going to see all of Antarctica melt this century, right? That's not what we're talking about. There are portions of Antarctica, particularly these ice shelves that are floating on the bays, that are melting pretty quickly. Part of this peninsula that goes a little further, equatorward, melting as well. So it's mainly the edges, but as that happens, these are glaciers, right? Moving rivers of ice. As you remove the end of that river, it's like breaking a dam, and you accelerate the movement towards the ocean. Then you melt it and contribute to sea level rise. So those are kind of the flow rates of those big glaciers and the drainage patterns there. And you can see at the edges here, key places scientists are watching to look for melting and collapse and contribution to sea level rise. All right, so over the decades, we can see the amount of ice loss in Antarctica has been accelerating. And again, that's contributing to rising sea levels. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of go quickly here. That's just an example of one glacier on one part of Antarctica that's melting.
Ice sheets rest on the ocean floor and can melt from both above and below sea level.
We have warm waters that are near those ice sheets. And if those warm waters actually touch the marine ice sheets melt.
So while the atmosphere is warming, so is the ocean. So the challenge here is you could have melting from below and above.
The land-based ice behind them moves more quickly toward the sea, and this poses the greatest threat for rapid sea level rise.
All right, so a little bit of a video that shows how you can actually be melting the ice even in the wintertime if the ocean temperatures warm from below. And our ocean temperatures are rapidly increasing. The oceans are actually kind of saving our tails right now. They're taking in a lot of the carbon, making the oceans more acidic. It becomes carbonic acid. And they're absorbing a lot of the heat, like over 90% of it. Because right now the oceans are cooler than the atmosphere, and heat goes from warmer to cooler objects. So the heat's going largely into the oceans. But as we're doing that, we're warming the oceans, right, which is decreasing that differential, making that process less effective, right, which is going to start increasing our atmospheric temperatures. But definitely much warmer oceans than when you and I were born. All right, so that leads to sea level rise discussion. Sea level is rising for two reasons. One is thermal expansion. As you warm the water, it expands. That increases sea level a little bit. The big one is just adding water to it, right? Melting ice, putting water in it, is increasing sea level. So we see right now it's increasing about 3.3 millimeters per year, but it's not a linear growth, right? The concern is exponential rise and the impact that'll have. So this is what we measured so far, and we have different projections. And the reason we have different projections is it depends on what we do, right? These are really kind of social and policy decisions of whether we are aggressive in how we address climate change, whether we just keep doing what we've been doing, or we have something in the middle. All roads point towards something in the middle, probably, maybe a little toward the higher end here. Definitely not doing this, right? We're not eliminating carbon immediately globally. That's just not happening. We're not doing anything. That's probably not good wording, but we're kind of in the middle. So probably end of this century, we're looking at something like a 2 or 3 foot, right, maybe 4 foot sea level rise. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, right? You think you just go to the beach and it's 3 feet closer. That's not the way it works, right? You bring up the ocean level in flat coastal plains, that can be a large area. In a lot of our coastal cities, that could be a lot of real estate and a lot of people. So we're talking tens of millions of people that have to either adapt to living over or in the water, or they're going to have to relocate. In the southeast, Atlanta is one of the key places where people will likely relocate from coastal South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So prepare for rapid growth in this region and higher real estate prices as there's more competition. Southern Appalachians, same thing, people head for the hills, literally. So the percent of the population at risk is pretty high in the U.S. We're a very coastally developed country. Vast majority of the population is close to the coastlines. Much higher percentage in some of our Persian Gulf countries. Bangladesh is the one that is probably most concerning. Netherlands, right, where there's areas that are below sea level, just protected by dikes and levees that are going to have to be improved as sea level rises. So a lot of challenges. Bangladesh, I'll just mention, I guess, since it relates to one of the other discussions, I think, India and Pakistan. Bangladesh is largely a low-lying country, and as sea level rises, you're going to have areas that are flooded. As those areas are flooded, people move inland. Right now, they're going to Dhaka, the capital, which is, too big. There's not enough water and sewage for everybody, for example. Eventually, they have to go outside the country. India almost completely surrounds Bangladesh, and they have fencing and guards to keep them out, and so you're going to run into tensions. And the big question is, will Pakistan come in to help Bangladesh, which used to be East Pakistan? And if they do, does that amplify the debate, the violence really between India and Pakistan, which are both nuclear-armed countries? So the United States has to think about that, right? That's not just a problem for the two countries, that's a problem for the whole world. And so there's, war games out there for that exact scenario. That's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night, more than just, warming temperatures, which are important. It's our reaction to the impacts of those warming temperatures that are really hard to predict. All right, so what does it look like here in the southeast? If we just have a 3-foot sea level rise, again, think 80 years from now, this is what the map of the United States may look like with a 3-foot sea level rise. And we lose a big chunk of southern Louisiana, right? And New Orleans, what are they going to do, right? Do you keep building higher and higher? Do you relocate? What politician is ever going to make that decision, right? Who's going to have the courage to address difficult conversations like that? That's tough, right? South Florida, same thing. Our barrier islands and river valleys, the Outer Banks, right? There's a lot of areas that are going to have difficult discussions. So if we look globally, cities at most risk include places like Kolkata, Mumbai, Dhaka, Bangladesh, and in the United States, the only one on here is Miami, right? That's by population. If we look at economic impact, you get a very different list, right? Then you see Miami up there as the top, and New York City, right, which is very coastal. So we do have some major concerns in the United States, too, about the economic threat and the stability of the real estate market in a place like Miami. Can you resell a house as water takes away their source of water, right, fresh water, and or surrounds the home? You can't build a wall in Miami because the soils are so permeable, the water just goes under and through. So here's Miami Beach recently. This is not a hurricane, right? This is just high tide. So it comes up through the sewer systems quite often and floods the roads. So we see this with the king tides even here in Georgia now, and starting to happen with increasing frequency. Right, so talk to friends and neighbors that live in coastal areas and you'll start to hear, yes, there's this inconvenience, and occasionally we have to close schools, or you can't get to South Street or whatever it is in the town. It's starting to become a way of life. And how long can that continue is a real question. Saltwater intrusion into drinking water is a threat for the wells and aquifers in coastal regions. An example here, Hollandale Beach having abandoned several of their wells as saltwater intrudes. As sea level rises, it intrudes underground as well into those aquifers. Charleston, I'm from South Carolina. I'm from Spartanburg, upstate, but Charleston is having a much higher frequency of flooding, affecting places like the market and places along the coast, getting up to the top of the battery quite often. You'll see it in imagery. And for homeowners and businesses, it's very disruptive. How do you rebuild your home? How do you replace your carpets and insulation? It's just an expensive process. The Hampton Roads, Norfolk, Virginia Beach area, right, constantly dealing with issues. They have a really big challenge because sea level's rising and the land there is actually sinking, right? So it's a double whammy. In that part of the world, it's making it happen faster. We talked about other parts of the world where this is occurring. Already in the U.S., we have 2 communities that are abandoning their entire towns, right? They're relocating inland. In the United States, both happen to be Native American communities, so you can talk about social issues here as well and the way that's happened historically. In Alaska, this is due to coastal erosion, a place where we used to have solid ice hitting solid ice, right, permafrost. As we melt the permafrost, it becomes like mud, much easier to erode, and now you have liquid waves hitting that. Erosion rates amplify quickly as we melt permafrost in Alaska. So that town voted they have to abandon because they're losing their airport and their school as it collapses into the ocean. Ile de Jean Charles, I'll show you in a second, is a coastal area of Louisiana where sea level rise, oil extraction, salt extraction underground are causing sinking, and then they come in and build these pipelines and destroy the wetlands that protected the area. Leads to things like this, right? So they've decided to abandon and move about 90 miles inland, right? The entire community. This used to be fields out here, agricultural, so sea level rise rapidly affecting that region. All right, and then we think about Pacific Island nations, it's just heartbreaking, right? Having to relocate maybe thousands of miles away. Kiribati looking at other countries to host them, right? Tuvalu looking at New Zealand, Marshall Islands locating to Springdale, Arkansas. There's an amazing New York Times article about that. That's part of an agreement we had because we tested nuclear weapons there, that they could do that faster without having to go through the whole immigration process. And they decided to try to go to one community to preserve their culture as long as they can, which is probably a smart decision. But halfway around the world. All right, ocean acidification I mentioned. As carbon goes into the ocean, we get carbonic acid. We can measure the pH levels in the ocean decreasing. So I don't want to say they're acidic because they're not. They're still alkaline, but they're less alkaline, so they're becoming more acidic, if that makes sense. The pH is reducing, but it's not like a toxic vat of acid out there. The impact it has, though, is it thins and starts eventually at higher levels dissolving shellfish. Right? So that's a base of a lot of food, in Pacific Island nations in many parts of the world. So seafood industry hurt and marine ecosystems hurt. Coral reefs that are bleaching and dying off due to a variety of reasons, increased temperature, pollution, reduced water clarity, tourism, there's a lot of disruptions there. So several key tipping points that we're approaching. Tipping points are when you cross something and you can't get back to what you had before. One is the melting of the Arctic, right? Once we melt that ice cap, it's hard to get it back because it feeds on itself because you expose those darker colored surfaces. One is marine ecosystems, right? Once you kill off that coral that took thousands of years to develop, right? It's a big living organism, you can't get that back in any reasonable time. And everything that depends on that, the entire food chain in the ocean, you can't get species back when they're extinct. Right? So there's real impacts here where it's not just, we need to slow this down and be careful. It's like we need to really address this before we pass a point of no return on some major issues. Right? So I think that's important to know. Extreme weather, again, is you're stacking the dice towards more extremes when you add energy and heat into the system. We've seen some examples of that. Again, these are weather examples, but if you start consistently seeing this, right, these trends may be pointing towards some climate signals. Most research on tropical cyclones, hurricanes, shows we may not change the frequency very much, but the intensity is likely to amplify as we warm up the oceans and atmosphere. So we may not get more hurricanes, but the ones we do may be stronger. There's a little bit of a signal of that, but again, no proof, right, verifiably yet. Of the most intense tropical cyclone ever recorded was in 2015. It hit Mexico, western Mexico, Hurricane Patricia. The strongest in the South Pacific, right, that broke the record from the year before. So we're seeing these consistent trends. Some pretty big ones here. Hurricane Michael recently, right, fourth strongest in U.S. history. The impacts of that are just devastating, right? Hurricane Maria, when it went through Dominica, they had to abandon the whole island eventually and rebuild to come back. What happened in the Bahamas with Hurricane Dorian was just catastrophic, right? So you've seen the images, but to think about the human toll of these things is just difficult to wrap our minds around. And we like not to think about it, but we should know in Georgia it could very easily be us as well. floods. Floods are something that's probably not getting as much attention as they should. We've had a lot of that lately here. Globally, though, we can see floods that have been just catastrophic in the scale, right? Destroying agriculture, right, which affects food supply, cities and people's property. This one I think was pretty eye-opening last year in the Midwest. It lasted a long time. It flooded places like this Air Force base, which helps to control our nuclear arsenal, right? So there's some major, again, national security implications. This is Pakistan a few years ago, just a massive flood. And then the other extreme, right, where you have dry soils, the heat dries out the soils more. Or you have flooding, we increase the intensity of precipitation, and you amplify both extremes of precipitation. So we see drought and occurring more frequently. We've seen reservoirs become really low, right? Even Lake Lanier in 2008, right now it's almost a record high. Rapid changes occurring. So I think people get a sense something's unusual, and you can't attribute everything to climate change. You got to be careful that there is that signal there, but you also can't, close your eyes and stick your head in the sand, and you got to realize, there's definitely something going on. Cape Town, South Africa, Sao Paulo, Brazil, right? Major global cities that have come close to running out of water. And let me get back here, Yemen. Right? Yemen is a heartbreaking story where the second largest city ran out of water and people started fighting over the one well, right? Literally killing each other. And combined with outside influences has led to a brutal war and famine that's occurring right now, which has political but also environmental roots to it. The war in Syria, right? Largely political, but also had environmental roots to it. The worst drought in hundreds of years. Right before that, forced farmers into the cities. And the farmers didn't have the skills necessary for the jobs in the cities, and they needed help, being new to the city. Government didn't provide it. They marched in the streets. The government used the military against them, and then they were armed and fought back. And, it's a threat amplifier, really, is what these environmental disasters can be. All right, so this is where we have potential water stress globally. And some of that's here in the U.S., particularly the southwestern U.S., Look at northern India, right? That's an area with a very high population, a lot of agriculture. So that's a concerning part of the world. The Sahel region, just south of the Sahara, where agricultural collapse is already producing mass migration of people largely towards Europe, largely through Libya. And the concern there is, again, the projected numbers. Recently, we've seen about 1 million people that have migrated towards Europe from the war in Syria. And projections are multiply that by 20 or 50. So 20 to 50 million people or so moving towards Europe over the coming decades. So how do you manage that, right? I don't have the answer for that. Those are rhetorical societal questions. How do you keep people safe that are moving, and migrating, refugees? How do you absorb that many people, right? Do you have housing, food, jobs? Those are real questions that the world's going to grapple with as these changes amplify. Wildfires, I think we have seen those. A lot of visuals coming out of the big wildfires. To put it in context, the California wildfires were massive, 2 million acres burned in 2018. The fires we saw in the Amazon earlier this year, 2.2 million acres, right? Mind-blowing that a rainforest is burning, right? They should be getting rain. Siberian wildfires we didn't hear about, 3 times as large as what happened in the Amazon and in the U.S. And then the Australian is just mind-boggling. Australia has wildfires, but to have over 12 million acres burned is off the charts, as the scale, right? Disastrous. So that does a lot of things. It kills people, right? It destroys property, it destroys habitat, right? Billions of animals were killed in the Australian wildfire. In Greece, people having to, and this happened in Australia too, people having to go into the ocean just to survive. It's pretty scary, right? Because we have preparedness, but preparedness is based off usually what's happened in the past, our emergency management systems. Are we incorporating what's going to happen in the future in our preparedness plans? It's key that we do, right, to keep people safe, but that can be challenging. All right, globally, right, global order, really a lot of the concern is going to be how do we keep resources where they need to be, right, for everybody there. There's a couple things happening. Population's growing rapidly, right, so that's just more competition for resources over the globe. As we grow population, we don't add a drop of water. Water's a closed system, right, so it just becomes more competitive, more expensive. We've seen the water wars here in Georgia, right, legal battles over the water in Lake Lanier between Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. And we get along, right? We're in the same country. Except football time, we always get along, right? So I think it's a signal of what if we didn't get along, right? What if this was Israel and one of its neighbors fighting over water in the Jordan River, right? Then maybe it's not just a legal battle, it's a literal battle, right? So things like that can amplify and get out of control fairly quickly. So there's definitely concern about resources, food, water, even air, clean air, which can be bought in a can now in places like China, becoming commodified and becoming too expensive for people that don't have the resources to live, right? When things that you depend on for survival become expensive, you're really pricing people out of life potentially, right? That is some things to pay attention to. Battling over land here in the South China Sea and resources as China's done the island building campaign kind of in the South China Sea. So it's a Chinese ship blasting a Vietnamese ship, I think, with water cannons there. Supply chain, we hear a lot about that now, right? The economic impacts of these disruptions as well. All right, so we have some major systems here that are affected by climate. I went the wrong way, sorry. All right, our crops. So agricultural research shows that the response to climate warming temperatures is different depending on which crop it is, right? Some can adapt more, some are more suited for it. All generally decrease in yield at different rates. And the two really concerning ones, corn and rice, are like key food staples for much of the world's population. If you combine that with declining fisheries in the ocean, which is another key food staple in many parts of the world, competition for food is going to grow, right? I had to pay a grocery bill last week that made me sweat, right? So look for those prices to increase. Food prices are usually the number one indicator of social and political instability too. When they spike, social disruptions start occurring. So it ties directly into global order. Okay. One thing I can say, generally in the Western Hemisphere, we have enough potential for food production that we could be a little more prepared than other parts of the world that are going to see a pretty steep decline in food production. And sadly, it's the parts of the world that are growing in population the fastest, right? So we either have to do a couple things, try to get a way to get resources there, right? Improve trade and infrastructure to get the food to the people, or people are going to have to move. All right, so that's one of the big concerns, again, is mass migrations of people away from places where survival isn't possible anymore. And you see quotes from a lot of our leaders, Defense Secretary here, climate change is a national security issue. Climate change is a national security issue. It causes instability. It's a threat multiplier is what they call it in the military. U.S. Navy, they are been pretty vocal because every one of their facilities is threatened by sea level rise. They're coastal, resources. Norfolk, Virginia is the biggest employer, in that region. So if you have to raise, all the structures and the docks and everything, that's really expensive. And if you have to shut down, that's a threat to our national security. So there's real concerns there on planning. How do we keep people safe as they're moving from one location to the other? How do we incorporate and assimilate new people into places where they're going? All that is a huge challenge globally. And do we end up with conflict, war, famine as a result of these mass migrations? It's a possibility if we don't plan accordingly. So projections there, you see the numbers are pretty mind-boggling globally, largely going towards Europe, United States, and Australia. Why are they moving? Because they have to, right? They're doing the exact same thing I would do and that you would do, right? If my child was hungry and I couldn't grow food anymore and I were a farmer, I would find a place where I could make some money and feed my child. That's just human nature, regardless of who you are and where you are. So it's a survival mechanism that you're not going to change with political approaches. So how to solve that is a conundrum I think the world is dealing with right now. We have several countries nearby that are really in that process of struggling with food production, but also political issues. And the dry corridor throughout Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, a place of real concern for not being survivable. All right, so we have concerns about food, water, pandemic diseases, and refugee crises globally that'll be coming up. And we're already starting to deal with these. I'm not saying these are because of climate change, right? That is not what I mean. These are almost like test cases for things that are going to be happening more frequently in the future, though. So I'll leave it at that, I think, right now. Yes. These are general maps of kind of where people are going towards the United States, particularly from Central America, towards Europe, from the Sahel region where agriculture is collapsing, and from the war in Syria, which is amplifying now as Turkey's troops are fighting with Syrian troops there in northwestern Syria, and towards Australia. What's fascinating about this is that we're animals, right? You see this with all plants and animals. They're migrating poleward as the world's warming. So this is just a theory of mine. Are humans doing the same thing other animals are doing? Is this part of survival and adaptation? Right, there's the projection for where animals would go, and they find corridors that are usually safest for them to transfer poleward and upward to temperatures where they can survive. So our land-based animals and plants are moving about 15 feet a day poleward and upward to try to stay in those thresholds where they can survive. That leads to new species interacting, things like invasives that have been a problem, right? There's supposed to be a river there with hydrilla filling it up. Extinction crisis, is something that probably doesn't get a lot of attention either, but some say we're probably in the 6th mass extinction event, right? We're in a new era, the Anthropocene, and there's a lot of interesting science out there grappling with what does this new normal look like and what does it mean? That's another threshold. You can't come back right after a species is extinct. Melting permafrost, here's that coastal community I mentioned. Also, when you melt permafrost, foundations crack because now you're over a liquid instead of a solid. So economic problems, infrastructure problems in our cold regions. Methane blasting out of the ground here as permafrost melts, right? You can see people up here for an idea of the scale, really eye-opening. And that amplifies warming because methane's a greenhouse gas. So another feedback loop that causes problems, right? Mosquitoes, they freak me out, so I'm not going to look, right? Most dangerous animal on earth is mosquito. So they carry all kinds of diseases, right? Mosquitoes, rodents, ticks, all we see their range expanding and new threats to us, right? Senator in North Carolina that passed away from a tick-borne illness, and there's some, odd things out there with ticks now. Zika, dengue fever, chikungunya, West Nile virus, right? All these new things we have to think about in the U.S. that used to only be endemic to the Caribbean. Longer pollen seasons, right? I think we all are familiar with that in the Southeast. So this is the estimated range of the type of mosquito that carries Zika virus, right? One that we've seen in Florida and that we'll face here in the Southeast likely. The problem with mosquitoes is two things. As it's warmer, they reproduce more and they reproduce faster, so there's more of them. Their metabolism increases, so they bite more often, right? So it makes the spread of the disease faster, even with the same number of mosquitoes. Okay, we see that in the health data already. All right, so our health officials are trying to warn us, it's not just a national security issue, it's not just a scientific issue, it's a health issue as well. Economics, I'm just going to say this is a tragic miscalculation, right? It's quoted here by economists as the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. and that we need to take action sooner rather than later. We hear a lot about the cost of addressing climate change, and there are costs of transitioning your transportation and energy systems to more renewable, sustainable, safer, cleaner systems. But there's a cost to not addressing climate change, and most calculations show that's much higher, and there's a human toll to that as well, which is a moral issue. All right, I want to mention this. We see these shifting global alliances for a variety of reasons, but a couple that are fascinating. One is China's expansion at the same time as U.S. is becoming more, kind of isolationist, a real change in global powers. Right? That's not entirely climate change, right? Climate's a small portion of that. That's largely political as well. But the Belt and Road project really is bringing Chinese investment, right, economic influence, and maybe political influence into a lot of Southeast Asia, Africa, even South America. At the same time, U.S. is reducing our involvement and our investment there. This new collaboration of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, trying to kind of counter the G7 and NATO, right, European U.S. influence. So we see the Southern Hemisphere becoming more politically active globally and aligning with two of the world's largest countries, India and China, which is a fascinating kind of counter to the past. And who knows what Russia's up to. So there's, a lot of interesting things out there. This is a big concern. Failed states, countries where governments collapse are ineffective, and that climate change makes those more likely. Those are prime target areas for opportunists, like terrorist groups for recruitment, people that are desperate, and where they can't be held accountable, right, in a failed state. They may not have a military that could prevent that from happening. So the more failed states there are, the more at risk the whole world is. So I think keeping track of that is something to watch as well. And of course, we don't want nuclear proliferation occurring, and this kind of return of nationalism and isolationism is not good when you're wanting global cooperation to address global challenges. We see that not just here, but also throughout Europe. Qatar, that whole debate was a fascinating reshuffling of alliances where we aligned with Iran, actually to kind of push back against what Saudi Arabia was doing. They blockaded Qatar and with their allies. So this kind of Cold War in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and their allies and Iran and their allies. And traditionally we're with Saudi Arabia, but on that one case we actually were on the other side of it. So that's a bizarre case. And then the rise of renewables, right? That's really what I call it, the race for the future. Who's going to control the future of energy? And the main two contenders right now are Europe and China, right? And they're kind of battling it out, Germany especially. And a lot of the innovation may occur in Europe, but China undercuts the cost and they kind of corner the market on solar panels, wind turbines, building them and exporting them. And the U.S. is involved, but we really need to think just competitively and strategically. We want to be the leader, the future of energy. So I think that's something to watch. We see religious groups getting involved here, looking at the moral implications and trying to care for the world and each other. I'll leave it at that. And I want to leave you on one little happy note here. Oh, sorry. So we have activism out there trying to raise the issue. So there are a lot of solutions to climate issues. I don't want us to say, it's just doom and gloom and there's nothing we can do and give up, and depression can be paralyzing, right? So you got to really think the way to stave that off is acting. So there are things going on. There are good news stories out there. They may not get as much reporting as attention as they should, but we see changes in food and diets, right? Less meat intensive, right? Which reduces carbon emissions through agriculture. Transportation, mass transit, right? Reducing cars on the road. And most automobile makers have committed to not producing gasoline-powered cars in 20 or 30 years, right? So that you won't have the ability to get one that uses fossil fuels. They'll be all electric at that point. While we get electric vehicles, we need to make sure the electricity is coming from renewables, right? So that's the second part. And then once we have electric cars powered by renewables, we're not emitting carbon out of our transportation and energy sectors globally. That's already happening. It just takes time to phase that in. Here we see in South Korea roads with solar panels all down the middle over a bike lane that's powering all the street lights and houses around it. So there's cool stuff. Tesla with their solar roofs, right, that powers the house and charges the car. And so the whole thing is kind of self-sustaining. The Candida building at Georgia Tech, which reuses its own water and powers itself. There's amazing things out there. So I tell myself this, cheer up sometimes, we're going to get there. It's just, we've got to speed it up a little bit. Social things that are happening. Georgia was fascinating. The Green Tea Coalition was a combination of green groups like the Sierra Club and the Tea Party groups, right? Often not getting along, they came together to kind of push Georgia Power to promote solar energy for environmental reasons, right, with the Sierra Club, but for property rights reasons with the Tea Party. I should be able to put solar panels on my house if I want to, right? So that's an interesting way to get action, I think, and maybe a model for how things could be done in the future. I put my money where my mouth is sometimes, right? Got to get out there and raise the issues. I'll leave it at that. This is a fascinating book, Drawdown. It goes through the top 100 solutions to climate change and ranks them on their feasibility and impact. So I encourage you to check that out sometime. We see divestment movements pulling money out of fossil fuels and putting them into renewables. $5.45 trillion have been pulled out of oil companies. Even the Rockefellers who made their fortune in oil have pulled all their money out of oil. On the way here on NPR, they were talking to students at Harvard that are working to get their retirement funds and all out of fossil fuels. So it's mainly colleges and churches that are doing this because of the impact on the future. And it's a huge transition of economic resources and power away from polluting industries towards cleaner industries. All right, I went a little over, but I had a lot to say. And so I want to, leave some time for Q&A here. Yes?
Very early on, it was mentioned CO2 is our major problem. We've gone up to 412. But one of the things that has happened that came up much later was the methane. The methane is 30 to 40 something times worse than CO2.
Yes.
And they were watching the heating in the Arctic, that it would not get to the Siberian tundra, which it didn't necessarily do. The Siberian fires release the methane from the tundra. And we have that in the air now, and I saw a caption go across the TV that the fumes from the Siberian fires had hit our west coast. And then it disappeared. I was waiting to see more.
Yes.
So that's already damaging. That's up there. It's done. The Siberian fires, we were waiting for the Arctic warming to do it. It happened with fires. Number two was the rainforest, which was giving us our oxygen back into the air. That has already happened. Number three, we're the only country out of 200 countries that did not sign the Paris Treaty. That is not helping anything. Yes. Number four, our main problem is going to be the aquifers, the salt water around the world at the coastlines getting into the aquifers of the countries. We're going to have the people moving inland. And everybody says, oh, well, if this floods, people can move inland. When they want to go inland, they're moving without any equity from their home. No one's going to buy their house. If there's flooding, if the water that they're trying to drink has salt water in it. And about 12 years ago, I showed a film, a documentary, where the president of Indonesia went to the UN, maybe even longer, maybe 14 years ago, begging for help because he knew that his islands were going to go under. Recently I read that in one of the hospitals on one of the islands, the newborn babies were dying, and they found out it was the saline in their water that they were drinking in their hospital from that particular island. And they were also watching a big, big chunk of Antarctica. We lost one chunk that had a little article in the paper this big. It was the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island.
Wow, yes.
A little article on the back page this big.
Yes.
And that's a very dangerous thing for rising the sea level. They're watching another big hunk, and I'll be done in 1 minute.
That's
a few
good.
years ago, I showed a
Preach to the
documentary
choir.
where the National Geographic people who were in Antarctica actually looked down and went, oh my God, there were rushing rivers way down below that they had never, ever, ever seen. This is maybe 10, 15 years ago. So that the Antarctic is getting it from the sun, and they're also getting warmth from underneath, making these rushing rivers. And Antarctica is going to be our biggest problem, probably because it's going to produce the highest rising of the sea level. And I get Bill McGibbon's 316, we're up to 412. And
That's right.
they're only giving us 20 to 50 years, not even the end of the century, because of the migration that's going to occur, the starvation and the water problems. Himalaya mountains are melting like crazy. They supply the water for 11 countries.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
When that goes, 11 countries have no source of water. So we are in very, very bad shape. And this went over it, all of it. But it's worse than some of these dates for 2013, 2014. It's worse than what's showing there.
Yeah.
And we can do things with our coal plants, with our automobiles and so on. But some of the damage is too far gone, like the Siberian methane and the rainforest
Yes.
and the melting of the Arctic. And there are 7 or 8 countries already fighting for mineral rights in the Arctic area.
That's right.
Whoever has a border on the country,
Yeah.
on the waters.
Arctic, yes.
I mean,
I need you up here with me, yes. This is awesome, yes.
I am extremely, extremely worried about my grandchildren's future. And
Yes, I understand.
a couple of them to get degrees in environmental something or other,
Good.
biology. But people are not taking it seriously because the answer is, well, they can move inland. With what? No
Right.
job, no money,
Right.
well, they can't sell their house. Also, they did not mention the Golden Isles except I saw Tybee.
Yes.
The Golden Isles in the end of the 1998, 99, Jekyll Island, and that's the other one.
St. Simons.
St. Simons.
Yeah.
We were staying at a motel on the water. There was Motel Road, steps down, and beach. And at high tide, now this is the late 1990s, the water came all the way up the steps. They had a carport garage for people through the garage, across the road, and onto the lawn of our motel.
Wow.
And that was that far back. And they had put big
Big
stones and
rocks.
one up, but
Yes,
the
yes.
cause of it is still there.
Yes, oh yes.
And PBS had a great show entitled Sinking Cities.
Yes, yes.
And
Yeah, PPS does great
Yeah.
things of trying to raise
New York
awareness.
City, they're gonna do a 22-mile foot around the edge, around the Battery, from West 57th to 10th Street. Well, that's only gonna help for a little short while.
Yeah, yeah.
They're gonna make it, 22 feet high, make walking paths. That's only gonna help a short time.
So you raise a lot of good issues. Again, I need you up here. That's you're
I'm very
preaching an
concerned.
important message. I'll say it this way. Myself and a few other faculty that I'm friends with, I've been talking about this, for 20 years, I guess now. It can be, there's a whole thing called climate grief out there. People that look at this a lot and just knowing what it means and the impact that has on you as a human can be challenged, emotionally. And we talk about what is the right balance where you're not, you got to scare people enough with the facts that they realize it's an important issue, but if you scare people too much, it's paralyzing, it's overwhelming, and that can actually be counterproductive if you're trying to get people to mobilize and take the action. So I struggle with what is that right balance of being honest and saying what the impacts are going to be, making sure I don't exaggerate. You got to be factual with everything, but also not downplaying it that everything's going to be okay, because it certainly is not. And realizing it's not just you move in from the sea. Yeah, there's these disruptions that are going to impact everything. And the beach doesn't just move in from the sea. You won't have that sandy beach.
No.
People are going to put up riprap, the rocks and seawalls and everything, and it harms tourism. It's not pretty, but property owners are going to do what they're going to do to try to protect it, and what they see as protecting it.
Tybee Island was mentioned up there, and we were at Tybee Island with one of our tiniest grandsons, and the water covered the road, and the people were blocked from getting off on the island.
Yes.
Now, then they did the 2018 real estate, and they showed how the real estate had gone down in millions in sales. Who is going to buy on any of these places knowing that they're going to be flooded and are already flooded? So Tybee Island's building a bridge, but they were flooded twice. We were happy we got off. It happened 2 weeks after we got off.
Yeah, there's talks of raising that whole road out to Tybee, which is a Band-Aid, for a little while, and eventually the discussion will have to be, planned retreat is what they call it, from the coast, yeah. I'll tell you that this was the most bizarre thing I ever saw. It's one of these shows on HGTV, like where they're selling houses, and people are buying them, and it was in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They were looking at a house, and there were sandbags on 3 sides, and it was sticking out in the water, and these people were seriously considering buying this house, like for a lot of money. And I was just thinking, what are you doing? So I don't know the thought process. I mean, it's beautiful, but if you have sandbags all around the house, it's probably a warning. Should be a warning sign. Yeah. Yes, I would think so. Yes.
Well, to what she was saying, people aren't taking it as seriously, maybe because it is a gradual thing, so you don't see it. It's not like if you've been around for years, you do see, like in Atlanta, just alone, as more trees have been cut to make more housing or whatever, you feel the heat in the city that you did not feel 40 years ago. I mean, it used to feel like, I wouldn't say tropical, but it felt cooler. All right, now you go out in certain areas and it's just a heat wave.
Yes,
because like the global warming thing is kind of like your car in a parking lot with the windows up, that car turns into an oven. It's
That's
the same
right.
kind of thing in our planet, and we're not addressing that. But my question was going to be, so with all these things, what would be like 1 or 2 things that a simple person could do day to day to assist, to help? Because if it is small, gradual pieces, if each person did 1 or 2 small, gradual things, it might help. What would you recommend for that?
So a couple things about that. It is important that we all do our part, right? And that scales up to have global impacts. One other debate I have is while that's extremely important and we got to do that, it's almost beyond that. Like really need to be pushing for systemic changes to be happening. So a couple things. One is definitely try to be as efficient as possible, right? Don't use, wasteful electricity, carpool, recycle, all these things are helpful. And by taking action, when somebody else sees that, it also helps, it incentivizes that they're going to do the same thing, right? If people see me taking my recycling to the curb, sometimes just seeing somebody do that gives them the permission or reminds them to do it. Like when somebody's hurt, nobody does anything until the first person does, and they all jump in. It's a psychological kind of thing. So taking action in that sense is important. The most important thing I honestly think, though, is working with your counties, your state, country, voting, writing your, representatives, and just trying to push for some ways to address this, right? Wherever you work, right? Think about what are your sustainability measures there. They're big contributors. You don't have to rely on the government to make the solution. Private businesses are doing some big things. What are you doing, McDonald's and Walmart and whoever, to protect my children as a consumer, right? You have a voice that way. And we're seeing great things happen actually in the private sector, surprisingly, and with states and local governments. So even though I am not happy that we're not a signature of the Paris Agreement, we see here in Georgia, cities like Clarkston and Athens and Atlanta and Augusta have all committed to be 100% renewable in the next 10 to 15 years. We've seen states that said we're going to go beyond our Paris Agreement commitments, like Hawaii and California, parts of the Northeast, regardless of what the federal government does. So pushing for those kind of changes has actually a big impact. So that's what I would encourage, find groups that are working on that, help them out, right, either with your time or money. And that's the scale that needs to happen fairly quickly because we don't have a lot of time to keep debating it, really.
People need to be educated because I was standing on a shopping line and I saw the early Sunday edition on a Saturday morning, Saturday somewhere. And in the lower left-hand column, front page, was a column about that big. And it was talking about the flooding on Golden Isles in Georgia, and Georgia's coast. And I said, well, finally they're gonna talk about this. When the paper came out on Sunday, guess what? It was gone.
Wow.
It was gone. They told them to get rid of that. Tourism is the largest industry for the
Oh, I
Golden
see what you're
Isles.
saying. Okay.
And people would have known, but no, it got taken off. They didn't put it out. And
There's an interesting thing I
same thing with
think about the media.
fumes that hit from the methane hitting the west coast. Don't let people know about that. That wasn't fumes, that was methane.
Right.
Yeah, we don't get educated.
So media is a tricky issue as well. There was a study a few years ago looking at media coverage for an entire year of climate change. And again, this was 2 or 3 years ago, but they were looking at CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, NBC, all of them, you know. And average was about 7 minutes for an entire year that they even talked about climate change, right? 2016, they didn't even talk about it in the debates. We're hearing a little bit more about it this year. They've had forums about climate change with some of the candidates. There was a whole Meet the Press episode 1 week about it, you know, so a little bit more. But mainstream media is funded by advertising. And if you watch the advertisements, wealthy corporations sometimes are invested pretty heavily in some of the root issues here, right? If you see American Petroleum Institute multiple times as commercials, they're in effect funding the salaries of the people in that organization. So it's hard to go against your funders. So that's why I think maybe PBS and others that aren't funded that way sometimes have more time and ability to speak freely about the issue. I watch Democracy Now! Sometimes, right, which is kind of a public, funded, and the way you hear stories discussed on there is very different than you would hear on, CBS or ABC. Plus, everything's just timed down to such a short, little snippet, 30 seconds or a minute or a little article, and you can't really get into the details, the deep dives into the stories, which something like climate change has to do. You need a lot of broad discussion.
So why do you think people are not taking this stuff seriously? Because I think a lot of people.
Good question.
Yeah, are very they take entertainment very seriously. They're not paying attention to what's going on. Because like you said, it's very interesting that something is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Something is going on. Apparently, there's something. So
yes.
I mean, why do you think that people are not taking it so serious?
So that's a $1 million question right there. I would like to know. That's one of my areas of research, is trying to understand, what do people think, but more importantly, why do they think that? Like, how are they developing their opinions? So my dissertation, I was looking at tornadoes and tornado warnings, and we would look at how did people get tornado warnings, how did they react to them, and why were they making those decisions? Because if you can improve that warning messaging, you could save lives, right? So that was kind of the goal of that. So now I'm taking that kind of information, saying, okay, what are our opinions about climate change, and what's affecting that, right? How are we developing those? So we interviewed, at UNG, we interviewed 5,000 students randomly and across all 5 campuses, mainly in North Georgia. And we're trying to say, okay, what are your thoughts on climate change, and is it human caused? 75% of them agree climate's changing largely due to humans. So they understand it. That's higher than even the national average, and we're a conservative region generally in North Georgia. And the underlying causes, usually politics is a big one, right? It's a big impact on our opinions, sadly, right? When I started looking at climate change, it wasn't very political. Back in the early 90s, right, the good old days. Then politics interjected itself into the argument. A lot of that was a response to action that was starting to happen in Congress and some of the wealthy, politically tied groups that didn't want to see harm to their bottom line. So there's been an active misinformation campaign, particularly in this country, to try to confuse people on the topic. Some of the same groups that tried to keep us from dealing with smoking cigarettes for a long time. So they sow doubt to try to prevent solutions. I think another part of it, though, is just self-protection. Just like if you had an addiction, the first step usually is not admitting that, right? It's easier just to deny it, pretend it's not there, because if you admit it's there, it puts responsibility on you, right? So if we collectively admit, oh, this is real and this is a challenge and it threatens my grandchildren, now I'm on the hook, right? Now I have to do something about it. And who wants to do that, right? We got enough to do in our daily lives. So it's really just to make our lives easier, we try to pretend it's not there. And then the other article I saw this week that was really fascinating, and I think it is important, given the times that we're in right now with this virus, right, versus climate change, is an interesting kind of evolutionary biology perspective. Like, we deal with short-term immediate threats pretty well. We don't deal with larger gradual threats, and that are possibly a bigger threat to us, right? This will likely kill more people, climate change, than the virus, but the virus is here now, right? And the virus is brand new, and so that raises our perception of its threat. I'm not saying it's not, important, but it's two very different thought processes. So we know we have emergency funding, and we're going to do all these things immediately to address this, and then we say this is a hoax, right? Or it's not even real, or we can wait, So those are two very different approaches, and I think it gets to human psychology and sociology. So I don't think we completely know, but I think a lot of it's just, our survivability and not wanting to think about it because we have so many things going on in our daily lives already. And we live at such a fast pace.
Yes, I'd just like to say that me and my wife, we are climate refugees. We've lived for 20 years. Well, I lived since 1965 in Florida.
Okay.
And we lived on the coast recently for the last 20 years. We were 10 foot above sea level.
Right.
And I have followed your entire argument for many years now. And it suddenly became very apparent to us that we have to move. We went from 10 foot above sea level to right now, we are, like this building is 1,000 feet above sea level.
Yes.
We are 250 miles from the coast. And so that was our particular thing. Like, once you realize it, you can get ahead of the curve, do something about it, sell your house while it's still worth something, and get to move out. Most people, unfortunately, don't realize it and don't act quickly enough to get ahead of things before things become really apparent. Now, the question I have is this. I'm sure you're familiar with Guy McPherson. Yeah, I see the smile. Okay. One point that he brings up is global dimming.
Yes.
Okay, now, he's working with some people now at a couple of different universities. And global dimming, by the way, is just the effect that all of this burning of coal especially and everything puts up something of a blanket in the atmosphere that obscures some of the light from the sun. Now, from what I understand, let's say tomorrow we cut off all burning of fossil fuels, just purely imaginary speculation. That would cause immediately a drastic jump in the temperature of the atmosphere because we have lost this umbrella that we've put up. And it seems to me then that the only real solution would be geoengineering to put something either in space or in the atmosphere to replace all of the smoke and soot and whatever is in the atmosphere that prevents some of the sun from getting down. The carbon dioxide is going to last for centuries. The methane lasts, I think, a half-life of like 20 years, which is still a long time. the immediate jump in temperature will take something like 2 weeks. So, in addition to all the little things that you have to do, you have to think of something that at this point we have absolutely no solution for. And there is very little work, I think, being done on this now, at least not that I'm aware of.
A little, yes. So great point. Yes, all of those. And welcome to Georgia. We're glad to have you, right? So there was a Forbes article that kind of walked through the components of that rising temperature and say that the temperature's risen 0.8 degrees over this century. And it does each component, like 0.2 degrees is from this, 0.1 from this. So there's mostly positives, right, from burning coal and from the different causes, land use change. There was a negative there, the negative sulfates that come from burning coal. So that is offsetting the warming a little bit. It's like 0.2 of a degree or so, right? It's not something we
It was
could
much
ignore.
bigger than that, but I don't know,
It
I'm
could
not
be, I'm not-
involved.
But it is
I
something.
don't know it.
Something to be aware of. If our air, first of all, our air pollution laws are going the wrong way, right? If anything, we may be getting more. But if we could clean that out of the atmosphere, we would get warming. But I also always say this to my class. I show it to my class. I have the calculation. We go through the numbers, and I say, I'm not saying the solution to climate change is more air pollution, because we definitely don't want that. But we do have to be aware as we clean up our air, we may have a little bit of extra warming if we get rid of the sulfates. But there's other causes that causes acid rain and other issues that we definitely want to get it out of the air.
Thank you for saying that. It makes me feel a little bit better.
Yes. I went to a whole conference on global dimming in Pittsburgh years ago. It is fascinating, but pollution, we need to get that out of the air for other reasons.
Understand. I don't know how true this is or not, but it was first discussed actually in this country by Benjamin Franklin.
Okay.
So there was a discussion on the effects of, the Industrial Revolution had kicked off in England,
Right.
shortly afterwards.
Mhm.
But apparently it was speculated that this is one of the side effects.
Oh, okay, yes. He was a meteorologist, right? Ben Franklin, and yes. Yeah, and climate change, that science goes back a long way to Fourier and Arrhenius and other scientists, centuries ago. Two quick things. I know we're about out of time. Geoengineering. Geoengineering is like using technology and solutions to try to reduce temperatures back to normal. There's some really out there examples of like putting mirrors in space to block sunlight or putting foam in the ocean or different things. I understand the desire to do that and that there are technologies that could help. I personally, this is just my personal opinion, am not a big proponent of those because I'd rather natural systems repair themselves, because the problem with geoengineering, A, we don't know all the unintended consequences, which could be very negative, and B, some human is going to control that system most likely. So if we think about putting mirrors in space, the most likely, it'd be a UN type of project. Most likely countries that would be put in charge of that would be Russia or China, because they have the most experience in weather modification efforts. And I personally am not a fan of them having a lot of control on global temperature. The other thing I saw was an interesting talk by a prominent geographer that said geoengineering, if your temperature is going up, and you do geoengineering and it drops the temperature, right, to maybe flat for a little while, you have to do that from now till eternity, right? And if you stop, your temperature spike back up to that up again. So the gradual warming, as bad as that is, would be less disruptive than the sudden spike that you would get if you stopped. So geoengineering to me is very risky, but there's a lot of proponents. They wanted to add a chapter to the IPCC report just on geoengineering last time, and enough people pushed back that it didn't happen, but I think it's inevitable. And the last thing with moving, it is important that people realize, if they need to take actions, but I think it's also important to realize there's people that cannot do that, right? The inequities of people that are too poor or have other, issues that maybe they would be locked in place, and they're going to be the ones that definitely suffer the most globally. So I think just a recognition of that and help, to try to reduce losses is important. All right.
I think that's going to conclude our program. Thank you so much for everyone's questions. I want to thank Dr. Mitchem for coming out and doing this talk. Thank you to all of you for coming. We hope that you will come to more of our Great Decisions series programs. And thank you so much for the information, and hopefully we're able to make a change in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you. My email's up there if you ever want to email and talk. Thank you all.